Kiwi on the right side of the ditch or the wrong side of the ditch. Just a very quick question about TPP and productivity, timings and value of productivity increases or economic impact on the New Zealand economy, and secondly, just the naysayers have got some strong arguments about pharmaceutical and democracy being tied up in a trade contract. What's your common sense feedback that you've been applying in New Zealand?
Oh, you mean on progress on the TPP?
On progress on the TPP, but the opposition argue that you're signing away a whole lot of things that shouldn't be in a trade agreement.
Oh, look, I don't think there's any secret that there's differences of view between the US and pretty much everyone else, particularly around intellectual property issues. And we're just keeping arguing our case. One of their targets for the last 15 years has been our government pharmaceutical buying agency, which has become a bit of an international model and has been very successful in keeping costs down. So they've spent a lot of time. TPP is kind of, from our point of view at least, just another episode in a long-running saga. In the end, everyone's got to give a bit to get an agreement, because I think the agreement would be very powerful for the Asia Pacific and for the US strategic interests. So my biggest worry about it is not so much whether an agreement could be made, it's whether the US understands the costs of failure. And I think the costs of failure in the US, in the Asia Pacific for them are very high. And I'm not sure, I think the President and his team understand it, but I'm not sure anyone else does.
Hi, Bill. One of the questions I asked you in our interview earlier, I'd like to sort of repeat that for the group, which is in one area New Zealand has been in front of Australia, which is that your automotive manufacturing industry closed in the late 90s. You've been through the transition that we're going to go through in a few years. What was the New Zealand experience of losing that automotive industry, and did fears of, say, a widespread deindustrialisation, did that amount to anything?
Look, I think at various times there's been that fear in New Zealand, but what we've seen in the last 10 years, certainly the last 5 or 6 years, has been a blossoming of innovative manufacturing. I mean, to produce anything in New Zealand, you've got to be pretty damn good at it, because your local market will be tiny and you have to export once you've employed about 3 people. And so the ones who we have all sorts of what one of our sort of leading innovators before he died called weird stuff. And so there's no such thing as a typical New Zealand manufacturer, because there's no scale and none who two do the same thing. And in my view, if you get around Australia, you'll find all sorts of these businesses, because, in your own way, you're subscale as well, sort of subscale on a larger scale. And so you'll find they're really good at what they do. So, I mean, this sounds weird, but New Zealand does have one viable steel producer. Okay, and a lot of places are getting wiped out. We've got one smelter still going, and could for a few years yet, because it produces the purest aluminium of any smelter in the world. So they've got to have that kind of specialty, and I'm absolutely sure in this kind of in this economy with the sort of history of innovation that's how it'll turn out. I mean, I just think it's like a number of the issues at the moment. New Zealanders would like to see the old Aussie confidence back about it. Okay, well, that one's gone by the board. Well, let's just get on with the next thing. You got thrashed by England one year and thrashed them the next year.
Thank you, Bill. Nick Rowley. I'm now at Sydney University doing other things. Previously, I've worked at the centre of the state government here, and also for 2 years at 10 Downing Street, and did a lot of work with Michael Barber's delivery unit. So your glimpse underneath the bonnet, as it were, of the economy and how the public service works was enormously refreshing and quite familiar, and good on you. But I suppose for me, my question is pretty straightforward. Rather than looking under the bonnet, where do you think the car's going? And if you could use 3 words to describe the attributes of the New Zealand economy in 2014, what would they be? And you've spoken of innovation. Innovation means change. in 10 years' time, let's say 10 years' time, what would the three words be? What would be the three words be that you would celebrate?
I think the first one is just resilience. It has become, we're reaping the benefits of some reasonably rugged change, up to 25 years ago. They've been through now 3 significant recessions, and now they know how to do it. And there's no, very little protection except for, the board that you line houses with. We've still got anti-dumping duties or something on that, and that's about it. We've got nothing to offer in free trade agreements. So we only benefit from them. Resilience would certainly be one. I think that...
Would you describe that as the economy now or the economy...
now it's going to really build as a strength. The second thing is, innovation's a very an overused term. Once public services start using a word like that, you should forget it, because they'll try and, create an innovation system, a unit and a system, and by definition it's not systematic, but we've all got innovation advice. But it's sort of our version of innovation. It's kind of distance-driven innovation, and we're going to get better and better at that, because we've stopped trying to act like we're close to everybody. So that would be 2. And I think, what would be a third one that we'd celebrate? It's just sort of, for us, it's I'm not sure there isn't one word for this, but it's wrapping services around what we produce. Like we've got this, our core capacity is biological production rather than desert production, which is your core capacity out in WA there, to export. It's biological production, and we're not going to give that away. There's been a debate at home about why don't you diversify away from primary production, and it's a bit like saying, well, why don't the All Blacks diversify from playing rugby? It just, it's what we do, mate. It rains here, stuff grows, so why would we stop doing it? And it's still, this debate's still going on now. We must diversify. No, we must actually get really good at what we seem to have been put here to do. So it's wrapping value around it. So instead of, we've got to get over this, our long-term internal debate. It's unfamiliar to you, but boring as hell for us. And that is diversifying. Well, the market will diversify if that's what it thinks it should do. Getting away from what we're good at. And whereas I'd like in 10 years' time, I'd like to be able to say, well, looking back, we've really learned how to wrap value, that is services, around biological production.
G'day. Lee White, CEO designate from the Australian and New Zealand Chartered Accountants. Thanks for the remarks. One of the challenges for the Australian productivity is around our poor record on infrastructure, lack of investment, ageing, etc. So I'd be interested to just get your assessment of the current state of the New Zealand infrastructure and where you would be concentrating or putting your priorities on improvement.
Well, we again just picked up the Aussie examples about infrastructure plans, and we've probably been able to carry it through just because we're a simpler jurisdiction. So we can give you a set of documents that lay it all out in a reasonable amount of detail, not quite as much as the construction guys want. They just want a list of fixed projects that are guaranteed to be funded with a starting dates through to 2030. And it doesn't quite work like that. But nevertheless, where we're going is the next big tranches are really mainly dominated by Auckland Transport. So it's rebuilding Christchurch, and then the next big steps in what's been an ongoing process in Auckland Transport. But that's all now pretty clearly understood. In fact, last week we just produced our first sort of evidence base, because it's been a bit of a fact-free discussion, and now we've taken a sort of stock of data, or data about all the stock of what we've got, and it's actually not too bad, but the quality of decision making needs to be better. But it is going to be. I mean, we think of it as an infrastructure for growth now. It's all reasonably rational, not too political the way it's laid out. and attractive to Australian investment that's looking for a competitive economy. So there's less bottlenecks. It's pretty well organised. That's alongside a resilient labour market, reasonably stable energy pricing, efficient ports. Bring us your cash.
Good afternoon. My name's Peter Hong from Teradata. That's an amazing segue, that last answer, because I was really interested in how you got the suits to share the data with you to drive those evidence-based decisions that you guys have adopted. So how did you get all the data to feed the scorecards, and how did you convince everybody to share it with you?
Oh, well, it's been an ongoing process. Again, so if you bear in mind the starting point was the global financial crisis and this concern that the world financial system was in crisis, and we borrow a lot of money there. Banks those markets shut down for a few months. It was pretty scary stuff. So a lot of business attitudes shifted, I think. And so the stuff we produced last week is a product of 3 or 4 years of ongoing engagement. And we've constructed our microeconomic policy process around continuous, transparent engagement with the business community. So it's all laid out in 6 documents that shows which ones are ticked off, which stuff's in progress, which ones are in the pipeline. They can pick any of them up at any time and say, you're missing this bit, put that in. Now, we disagree occasionally, but even on issues like the labour market regulation, we found a pretty broad-based consensus. If some changes, they'll probably stick, and everyone thinks, well, it's probably got about as far as it can go. Let's get on with the next thing. So in terms of convincing them, it's not difficult now because they're engaged in a gritty, responsible discussion. Okay, and we set that standard pretty early working with business. Don't come in and just whinge, particularly about skills. I hate them whinging about skills. Well, because we can, the government can't provide an endless supply of highly skilled, cheap people. We don't run businesses, they do. We can't, we can get them to the start line. But so come along with propositions. And actually that's been now got bedded in as a healthy culture over the last 3 or 4 years. So it's been a very good process largely run by my colleague Stephen Joyce, now Minister of Economic Development, who's done a fantastic job on it.
Just going back to your comments about doing stuff that we're good at, I'd just like if you could to give a few remarks about the importance of Fonterra to New Zealand. There's been a little bit of a debate here after the Warrnambool cheese takeover that perhaps a Fonterra type model in Australia could be a goer, but obviously Fonterra got an exemption essentially from New Zealand competition law to allow it to form. Controls, I think, 95% of the milk in the country. So just if you could give some comments on the advantages of the Fonterra model and its importance to New Zealand.
Look, it's how important is it to New Zealand? It's pretty important, but it's not. Sometimes it's the significance of it can be a bit overemphasised. So it's the significant growing chunk of our export base, but it's been displacing sheep and beef largely, and that's certainly what's happened in the area that I represent down on the bottom of the South Island. It's important and it's performed very well, and the export prices have been very good. The big chunk of the growth has been China, but I wouldn't say yet we're over-dependent on it. Like, we're much less dependent on milk powder to China than Australia is on iron ore to China. Okay, it's several times more intensified for Australia. There's trade-offs with the Fonterra model. Remember, it was building on what was a statutory dairy board operation before that, so it wasn't a new concept for New Zealand. But it has been structured in a way to encourage competition, and the shareholders don't always like that. They tend to think there shouldn't be anyone else allowed on the landscape. I think they now understand that's not possible or politically viable, and so we are seeing gradually the competitors get up and going, because in a small country you can get concentration risk, right? That is literally one management team dominating your export trade. Well, you just can't afford to have that. And one of the smaller examples of it, which is the kiwi fruit industry, have shown, both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of the model. So the strength is they can actually dominate slices of a world market, and the kiwi fruit industry has, but then they've only got a couple of cultivars and they've got a disease in one of them, the high value one. And now they've got a few issues with some of these sort of, whether there's backhanders being paid in China and whether their agents broke the law or didn't break the law, and they're the only sellers of the product. So you just got to, anyone who's thinking about it needs to keep those things in mind. But there's, Fonterra has broad support. It's, I think that the political, the exemption it got will remain in place, provided people can see there's other competition putting a bit of pressure on them.
Right up there, and then Jim next.
David Hand from Newport Consulting. I think I was very interested in your comments in relation to improving the quality of the service that the government services deliver as a way of improving productivity of what you do. But my question then goes to the other side of the equation, because of course over in Australia we've got the resident bad guy's a guy called Campbell Newman. If you ever watch the ABC News or listen to ABC Radio, who of course is attacking his own government's financial circumstances, looking at the cost and efficiency side. And I would wonder if you've got any comments about what that agenda is like in New Zealand.
Look, I certainly couldn't comment on any of the state government activities here, just because, I do follow the politics of it, but I don't know much about the innards of it. Although we are hoping to see some radical experimentation that we can copy and justify by saying they're doing it in New South Wales or Queensland. Well, I hope so. Because we have, most of our interaction actually is with state governments, because they do most of what we do, everything, and they're doing a fair chunk of service delivery, and that's where all the politics is. So we focus on it. We haven't excluded a focus on cost and efficiency, but we haven't been as aggressive about it as the state governments here have. We've tended to put a lid on it and say, right, you're not getting any more money for the next 5 years. So most of them have had sort of 12 to 15% real cuts, right, over the last 4 or 5 years, but not the sort of 20 to 30% one-offs. And one of the reasons is that in the past in New Zealand, when that's been done, you run the risk of ending up first bringing major change being executed by management who do not know their business. Okay, and if we'd done that in 2019, these guys had just had 7 or 8 years of 10% compound increases in their budget. They had no idea what was going on in their business. They were spending all their time in the minister's office sucking cash out of the system. And, the front line, who are those people? Apparently that's where some of it goes. Okay, would you like to meet them? So that's one risk. And we in the 90s, we ran into all sorts of political problems from lack of execution, because from people who were trying to meet very hard targets but had no idea what their organisation is. So we've given them time to get to know what the hell goes on in their organisation. The second thing is that if you're in that environment, you run the risk of ending up with them producing cheap and therefore ineffective services. So we can save some money in health, but if it's going to end up with grandma being turfed out on the street at 11 o'clock at night because there's not enough beds in the hospital, guess who's going to win? Grandma, not us. And I've been through all that. Okay, where you do all this hard work, you fight all the politics, and then the other guys get in and just spend it all. They just say, we'll just shove another 10 or 15% in there because that'll be popular. And you lose all the gains, and that's exactly what happened in our health system. We had big productivity gains through the 90s, But because we hadn't made it politically sustainable, we lost them all in the next 5 or 6 years. It went backwards in quite a big way, and now we're starting to claw it back again. So we've gone for focusing on results, taking your time, and political sustainability. So as a centre-right government who's managed an austerity program, we're going into our 6th year and we're polling high 40s. And we've got a chance of winning another election. 50-50, maybe a bit better. So that's not a bad recipe. And we're getting to surplus. So our deficit was 9% of GDP 4 years ago, including the earthquake of Christchurch, which was the equivalent of it's cost us 8% of GDP. So our recipes worked for us.
Jim Longley, Chief Executive, Ageing, Disability and Home Care in the New South Wales Government. New Zealand has already long been in major disability reform. Australia is just in the early stages of National Disability Insurance Scheme. The regime you were talking about earlier of actively managing the long-term liability, to what extent have you applied that in the disability sector, either through your disability reforms or adjunct to that?
Yeah, well, look, we've got slightly different worlds than yours, and I'm not sure how applicable it is. And I certainly wouldn't push our disability sector as a great example of everything working, okay? But I think this long-term liability model is going to raise a whole lot of the questions that need to be answered in your NDIS. The one difference is that we don't have a levy because it's not funded, right? It's just a notional liability. And I'm sure that question is going to come up in the future. But, we've got the ACC, which is all the accident-related disability, and that's all in its own system. It's starting to perform reasonably well now, with rehabilitation rates improving. And in the non-accident disability sector, it's just been a kind of pay-as-you-go system where they get their services from the health sector. Those services have improved quite a lot, but there isn't really a driving performance framework around it, I'd say. So, and I think what's going to happen is the welfare reforms are going to produce that. So I can see our welfare agencies becoming purchasers of disability services, okay? Because they'll say, well, I've got this person here, and if I could just get X, Y, and Z, then they would be employable. And so they'll be putting sort of investment cases to government. Okay, so we'll get a kind of virtual NDIS. I think that's how it's going to work. And so I'm personally really interested in how this is going to unfold on both sides of the Tasman. Because what you're trying to set up is kind of our ACC for non-accidents. And, that's got pluses and got minuses, and the thing we're doing is pretty much untried anywhere, so we don't know quite what the minuses are yet.